Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We're back with another In Context. Today's June 1st, 2025. I'm going to title this podcast The East Asia Influx because there's a lot of back and forth going on right now between China, US, Australia, and France. Macron was recently in Singapore and he gave a very interesting speech. I want to discuss the speech and see the ramifications of what he said.
Thank you. So I'll just start by setting the context for this. The speech was the keynote speech for the Shangri-La Dialogue. This is an annual conference held by the English International Institute for Strategic Studies. I think it's significant, although it's not earth-shattering, because of what it means to the international or the state of international affairs that spans from Europe to Asia. So fundamentally, he was talking about both of them at once. He was actually supportive of the US pulling out of Europe. And that is not strange because France for a long time had wanted to get out of or from underneath US domination of Europe. This goes back all the way to de Gaulle, and he was actually citing de Gaulle explicitly. I'm not sure, however, whether that is going to be as radical as he thinks it to be, because the US calculates that Europe, that is fundamentally France, Germany, and possibly Italy and Spain, can't stand on its own against Russia, even if you add to it the English. And in the end, they will have to depend on what they call the US security backstop. So Europe trying to trying to stop or check Russia would end up meaning that the US would successfully contain it because it will need US support to mount an incredible check on Russia. And that means that they can't get very far away from what the US wants. Not just that, because now the US wants friendly relationships with Russia, it means that the US would be balancing both of them. This used to be an old British policy in 19th century called balance of powers. The British were always, the English were always pro balance of power in Europe because that meant that the Europeans kill each other while they look from outside and just maintain the balance. So it looks like the imperial age all over again. So that this part is I didn't find very important. The important thing, however, on the other hand, was Macron telling the US, no, we're not playing your game of containing China. You want to fight China, you fight it on your own. We do not want to be part of a pro-US sphere against pro-Russia sphere. This is bad and dangerous, and we shouldn't be doing it. That was the important part to my mind. Joseph.
I think this is one of those weird deals where both sides sort of, I think, feel empowered. Macron is, finally exerting this sort of trying to separate and decouple somewhat from the Americans, whereas this is sort of what Trump wanted in the first place. Sort of like, I guess one way to put it in an analogy, sort of take the training wheels off the EU and let them go sort of have some autonomy and pay a little bit more into their own defenses. And then if things get really serious, the US probably be there as a backstop. In the EU and France knows that. But Trump's, I think, assuming that things won't get so serious, and in the long term, the US could save a lot of money. I think that's sort of how we see this. So I think both sides feel like they're getting something out of this, when in reality, they're both sort of balancing each other, as you sort of said. But I agree that I don't think the EU alone, if it did get serious, could take on Russia without the US help. But I genuinely think that these guys upstairs with Trump, they don't think it's going to get to that point. I still think Trump believes he can eventually work out some kind of deal with Russia, even though right now that seems sort of off the table, especially considering the events that just happened a few hours ago. But I still think that in his mind, he's the ultimate deal maker, right? And if he fails to come up with a deal, that makes him look bad. So, but I agree. I think what's really interesting and what is sort of the more serious flex on the part of the French is this not, this basically telling the United States we're not going along with your China game, right? Because I think the EU recognizes that China is going to be around and they're not going away. And there's really no point in starting an unnecessary sort of hostilities with probably the second most powerful country in the world at this point. So I think the EU is probably trying to go the Turkish route a little bit, where they sort of are able to play both sides. But I think in the end, unlike Turkey, who I do feel is probably more autonomous, I think the EU will still always be more under the American umbrella. So they'll never achieve full autonomy. And I think that's just how Trump wants it. I don't think he wants them to be fully autonomous either. I think he wants them to think they're autonomous, for them to pay for their own defenses, but to still have that umbilical cord connection. So when things get serious, the United States can still step in. That's sort of how I see it.
I'm trying to probe beyond Trump's performative art and superficial inanities, like his comment about Macron's wife slapping him, which is superficial inanities. What I'm trying to look at is the strategic aspect of this. So strategically, whether Trump realizes it or not, he has strategists, and I think the US is adjusting its position from an adversary to Russia, to an interlocutor of Russia. And that to me sounds like the US wants to act as a balancing power, while Europe, on the other hand, still looks to it as a final backup. So this is weird balancing act, but maybe they can pull it. And yes, you're right that the US calculates that this would mean that we offload our expenses to Europe. We managed to get the competition and aggression to be contained between Russia and Europe while we stay above the fray. We managed to balance them against each other. We contain each of them with the other. That calculates very well for us. But what I think they are not figuring out is the Europeans are also not fool and not playing their game with China. This is significant because until now, Europe's calculation was, we may not like what the US is doing, we may not like their aggression, but we are extracting a net value from the continued domination of the Western alliance as a Western alliance to the colonial empire in the world. They seem to be saying, well, actually, the calculation today is not as good. And it might make sense for us to, in some fashion, decouple the Western imperial alliance.
Mm-hmm.
So the recent discovery that what's happening in Gaza is a massacre, I think aligns with that. And actually, he was talking about that there. Because until now, although Europe is much more sensitive to the fact that the US and Israel have trashed all international conventions in Gaza, they haven't been talking about it. And I think the reason was because they calculate that maintaining the unity or image of unity of the Western alliance was more important to them than the undermining of their security that is happening through the undermining of these conventions. But lately, their conclusion is no, the cost is not worth the reward. And the fact that they are saying the same thing now about China, and we are not willing to go into fight with China, we don't want to be part of, at least France is saying that, we don't want to be part of the pro-US sphere against the China sphere. Germany made some noises in this direction, but they make noise in the other direction. But the French coming out and saying it is, I think, significant. It might mean that we are seeing some serious cracks in the Western imperial alliance. If that pans out, it would be great news for humanity.
I mean, like, if you travel around Europe, like, I live here, so I see it. I mean, there's Chinese businesses, there's Chinese construction all over the place. Like, the Chinese are far more involved in rebuilding parts of Europe's infrastructure, at least here in Bosnia. China played a major role in rebuilding the tram lines, building a highway throughout other parts of the Balkans. They're more visible than any United States companies right now, and I don't see the Europeans wanting to, to like damage this sort of relatively cheaper source of getting labor done. There's a reason they hire these Chinese companies, because they're relatively cheap and they're pretty efficient. And why would you want to, burn that bridge? It's because the Chinese, from what I've been told, give relatively good deals on some of these construction projects they're doing. And
Mhm.
I know here in Bosnia, here in Sarajevo, they have been very present. You see signs in Chinese in Sarajevo. It's very different than when I was here 10 years ago. So I think when you consider that economic aspect of China's continued engagement with the Balkans and with Europe in general, it's far more substantive than whatever is going on with U.S. China. I mean, right now, a major trade war is about to break down. This is something that might be a little bit off topic here, but basically Trump has set up a situation where if like the European Union doesn't change their policies on the way they tax certain digital use rights, it's called Rule 899 if you want to look it up.
Mhm.
Trump's threatening a 20% tax on all foreign people from regimes that are guilty of doing this, which include Germany and France, that charge U.S. companies extra taxes for using certain digital rights. It's really complicated tax law, but basically it's going to cause a massive flight of European capital out of the United States. And it's, as one analyst called it, it's not a trade war, it's a capital war, which is
Mhm.
potentially even more dramatic. So, there's some really murky trade stuff on the horizon, and this US EU trade is going to probably continue to deteriorate, which means China is going to be more important in filling in the gaps in the years to come, at least during the Trump years. So it makes sense to me why Macron would want to avoid unnecessarily starting a totally not in their interest conflict with the Chinese, because I just don't see China and what they're doing, even if it's, imperialism of its own right. It's just not in the European Union's interest to get overly bogged down in what's going on in the South China Sea. That's America kind of thing.
This helps me to crystallize thoughts that I started thinking about. Right now, the international order is just a Western imperial order, period. The Western imperial order is made of an alliance. It's not just the US. And I keep drilling this because actually this is something that people quite frequently ignore. The fact that the US is front and center doesn't mean that the Europeans are not sharing with it in the spoils. They might not share as much. They don't get the lion's share, but they get some share and they value that. The fact that they are rethinking their part of this alliance and they're not sure they want to be part of this alliance as it goes into clash with China is significant. If it actually leads, as we are seeing signs of that, to the alliance breaking down and three forces emerging instead of a single one, the US, Europe, China, that would be quite significant change. It hasn't happened yet, but there could be that could be the general direction of travel.
I think it'll be the general direction, but I don't think it's going to fully decouple. I just don't see three completely independent players on the
Couldn't.
streets here.
This is 19th century. This is nonsense. It couldn't.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it,
exactly. Like Europe will be less obedient, perhaps, and more adversarial towards the United States, but you're not going to have three major competing powers. And if you do, the third one certainly isn't going to be the EU. So that's just
by the way, people sometimes miss an important point. The EU today is actually the dominant power in economic regulation, not the US. And
yeah.
that is something that angers Trump and his crowd. That's why he's going after the digital thing. But not just digital, across a lot of economic spheres, the European Union is the regulator, the international regulator now.
Mm.
And that is something that happened over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
This is significant. Until now, there has been some sort of agreements or trying to paper over it. Whether that would break out, it's not obvious. But yeah, this is something that the US is not happy with. And I don't think the Europeans are about to relinquish it either.
I do have a question. It's more of a procedural question. Do you think Macron talks to the European leaders first before he throws this idea out there? Because that idea leads to analysts like you guys debating it, strategizing around it. or does he?
Shoot
Because
from the hip.
I see that and from my
Shoot, shoot,
perspective. Oh,
shoot
I'm
from
sorry.
the hip.
No, not just that. I was gonna say I see from my perspective the UK basically does whatever US wants. At least that's the perception I see over the last 10 years. They don't really do things outside of U.S. interest as far as statements go. Even though recently their comments on Gaza are interesting, that is a little different. Maybe that's one example. But or is it that France, in particular Macron, is trying to be the EU's point, like a point guard, like is taking the lead. So therefore, he throws this idea out there, and then in the background aftermath, he talks to the EU leaders and tries to get them on board. I'm just fascinated by the whole process. Does that make sense?
Macron's always been sort of the foreign policy NATO guy. France has always been the sort of hegemon of the EU when it comes to security questions, right? Obviously, the Germans are sort of still not eligible for that position for reasons we all probably can guess why. And since post World War II, France has regularly played the role of being the face, I guess you'd say, of European military and foreign strategy. So I think Macron probably did consult. I highly doubt he would just wing this and just talk out without consulting his allies. I think that'd be too risky. But I think people who probably could have predicted this anyways. I think people that are close to what's going on nobody's shocked that he said this, right? I think anyone who's really on top of things knows that the EU does not want to, participate in this looming conflict with China. So that's sort of how I see it.
Can I interject here?
Oh, of course.
The mechanics of the EU goes like this. France makes positions on foreign and military policy, but Germany enjoys veto powers.
Yes.
France wanted to go its own route, and the European Union to go its own route back in 2001, and wanted to create a European military force. The Germans made noises of we could go this route, but they vetoed it under the table. Okay. This time around, it's not happening. Actually, the Germans are starting to talk in a more militaristic way, and they're talking about, and they are acting in a more warlike way. And they are going in similar directions to France, not as obviously away from US as France, but not very different. The significant point I want to stress again in what Macron was saying is he was outright in stating that we don't want to be part of this American sphere. This is as far outward and explicit as I have seen any European official say that.
Which brings me to my second question. Of course, I'm speculating, but I'm assuming China's reading the tea leaves as well, and they're like, maybe we need to get ahead of this. And they talk to Macron as well, trying to get this momentum going. Is that a logical assumption?
They actually came explicitly saying we don't want war with the European Union. And we want agreement with the European Union. We don't want a trade war with the European Union. And last month there was negotiations about reducing trade barriers and reducing tariffs. And as a result, there was an opening to some Chinese car technology.
Mm-hmm.
So the Chinese see it obviously clearly, and they say it explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
The European Union until now has been saying, yeah, we like that, we may go this route, but they have not been very explicit. The Germans keep speaking with two voices. One voice says, yes, we should be not going into war with China. This is quite damaging to our business interests. And then they come again and say, well, and we should be de-risking and de-linking from China, which is essentially trying to move in the direction charted by the US without antagonizing China. Even Macron was keep talking about de-risking. So they took out of both sides of their mouth.
Because they're feeling it out. I get it. Okay, that brings up one more question then. That means US also sees the pushback, sees the back channel quote unquote negotiations or
It's not
potential.
channel, it's official.
No, what I mean is
go ahead.
they're stepping in also trying to hedge this off. but
Mhm.
their style under Trump is, I mean, he's clearly a demanding human being. And now I see why they're pushing back against Gaza. Because if I'm in that room and he's pushing back, let's say I'm Macron, Trump is pushing back, I can now throw Gaza back in his face. Say, that's the kind of future we see for us, huh? No, we can't have that. And it prompts another attitude in his mind.
The prospect of war and thus the concern about what rules govern war is not something that American politicians or the American public opinion consider, but it's something that is quite present in European mind. This is a very significant difference, and I think the Americans underestimate that. The American government, I mean, underestimate it.
This is a very interesting conversation because this is sort of like an area that I'm not all that up on, but I think I learned a lot, and I'm glad we had this discussion.
I agree. Thank you, Shabab. That was very insightful.